Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Stronghold 2 for PC. This is a real-time strategy game developed by Firefly Studios and published by 2K back in April of 2005, and it's the official sequel to the original Stronghold, although most people consider Stronghold Crusader to be an actual sequel as well. I mean, that's really more of a standalone expansion than anything else, but that's beside the point. This one's particularly interesting because it was a pretty big leap up from the original Stronghold and Crusader in terms of technology. They brought it into the full 3D realm with polygonal modeling and so on and so forth. And that didn't come without problems, of course. I'll get more into that later on. But suffice to say, the reception to this one was pretty mixed. Some people liked it, other people didn't like it. A lot of the longtime Stronghold fans thought it wasn't very good. In fact, a certain subset of them tend to hate it, almost irrationally so. And I think it wasn't really until later on that people started to actually appreciate Stronghold 2 for what it was, and what it wasn't, for that matter. So the question there becomes, what is Stronghold 2, and how does it compare to the previous two games? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it's a bit of a step up from the original game, but most of that is in the technology that it uses. It goes from the 2D experience of Stronghold and Stronghold Crusader into the full 3D experience that the later games in the series would become. And that's not necessarily a good thing. On the one hand, it's certainly nice to have all of the improvements that a 3D engine would bring, like a free-flowing camera that allows you to just quickly and easily rotate it around so you can actually easily place buildings, and you can alter their placement as well, so that they're facing certain directions. So that's certainly very nice. At the same time, however, they pretty much downgraded everything else. In terms of visuals, it looks okay for a game from 2005, but compared to the very nice sprite work that you had in Stronghold and Stronghold Crusader, where it had plenty of color and it had a lot of charm to it, this just feels lacking. It's all 3D modeling and animation, which is clunkier and more jagged, and the modeling's not quite as detailed as some of that sprite work was. And ultimately, the visual design suffers as a result. They also changed up the interface to some degree, but for the most part, it's pretty easy stuff to adjust to if you've played the previous games. Stuff is in fairly intuitive locations and isn't too far off from where it was in the original Stronghold and Stronghold Crusaders interfaces. That said, it does take some getting used to know where the new stuff is and where the old stuff is, because sometimes it's not necessarily in the same spot as it was. So instead of just having a sub-menu, for example, on castle structures that has things like gatehouses, it now just throws them into that particular segment without any sort of sub-menu. So it's things like that that you had to get used to, but by and large, it's all familiar enough that you're not really going to have any trouble if you've played previous Stronghold games. And then there's the sound design, which is both a good and a bad part of this thing. It's good in that they kept the same music from the original Stronghold. In fact, a lot of the tracks are outright the same. And they added onto it with more medieval sounding music that works really, really well for the setting. On the other hand, the voice acting is just worse. See, in the original Stronghold, they didn't take it very seriously, and it was kind of ridiculous. And they went a bit far with that this time around, but at the same time, when you're in the campaign mode in particular, it plays it way more seriously, at least in the war campaign. And so, you have this kind of weird dichotomy between the voice acting in the main campaign and the voice acting just in general, where you have peasants just having kind of goofy voices. These spearmen are all like, I'm confused, and things like that. But then you get to the campaign itself, and you have, for example, Sir William, who is just Mr. McSerious Pants. So it's just kind of hard to get used to that. And some of the voices in particular are pretty terrible.
Well, who was the other?
From a distance, it was you, Devereaux.
How interesting.
I have had them tracked down. I thought you could deal with them.
That said, you don't have the really goofy stuff like the women obviously being voiced by men in the original game, which admittedly makes me crack up way more than it probably should. But in this one, they actually had women voice the women in it, so it works out okay. That said, they still managed to lose some of the charm of the original game, and even worse, they managed to actually make some of the ridiculous stuff not all that funny. At least the sound effects are pretty much exactly the same as they were in the original game, only slightly better quality to some degree. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story is different depending on whether you're playing the war campaign, which is the main part of the game, or the peace campaign. The peace campaign is pretty simplistic, and it's basically just rebuild the country for the king. And it's basically just a series of economic-focused missions. Then there's the war campaign, where you're playing as Matthew Steele. You are the page of Sir William, who was captured by Lord Barclay, also known as the Hammer, and he's basically the big bad for this game. And so you help Sir William escape and have to basically help him take down the Hammer and reunite with the king, bring peace to the lands by conquest, that sort of thing. It gets more complicated than that, and there's certainly much more of a story here than the original Stronghold, but it's really not all that well written and not all that compelling. So what ends up happening is that you really fall to the gameplay to really bring things back. This is where things get more interesting, because they kept the same formula as the original Stronghold. You still build up a castle of your choosing with a bunch of different buildings available to you. You have your walls, you have your towers and gatehouses, and so on and so forth. You have various traps that you can put out in front of your castle. Again, pitch ditches are back, as well as the spear trap, basically. You build up an army in order to not only garrison your castle, but also to besiege enemies' castles and take them down by, of course, killing their lord. And so what ends up happening is that it plays out most of the same as the original game. You start off by siting your granary and your stockpile, you build up your industry, you build up your food production so you can support your people within your castle, you build up your castle, and you garrison it, and once you're powerful enough, you send out an army to attack other castles. Pretty straightforward stuff, but they changed quite a few things from both Stronghold and Stronghold Crusader here. For one, some of the buildings that were available in Stronghold Crusader are no longer available, or they've been changed up. You no longer have the crazy tall lookout towers like you had in Crusader, you just have a fairly decent sized lookout tower that's really more of the perimeter turret that was in the original Stronghold. So they basically married a few ideas from the original Stronghold and Crusader and put them into Stronghold 2. At the same time, they changed up a few things, like you no longer have crenellated walls to add to things to actually have the crenellations on them. They're actually done by default. And you can build multiple thickness walls, up to 3 thickness. And obviously that costs more stone. And of course, like the original Stronghold, you can still build palisades here. So they did take a bunch of ideas from both of those games and stick them into this. Another idea they took from Crusader being the idea of Mercenaries, where they are a higher cost than your normal units, but they don't require weapons to actually be produced. And so you get a bunch of different things, like most of the units that you had in Stronghold Crusader, only they've been altered to be more European, and things like Viking Berserkers, for example. So that all adds some variety to building your castle as well as producing your military, and there's interesting things with the castle itself, like different kinds of towers that might have hoardings, for example. Now, hoardings are basically just wooden constructions around the tower to help protect the people on top of the tower from archer fire, but those kind of towers can't have siege weapons on them, like the mangonels or the ballistae. And so, it's kind of cool to have towers like that, where you can have a bunch of archers or crossbowmen in there, and they're pretty well protected, but you can't put anything else in there, so you want to have different kinds of towers to help supplement that. There's also different defenses that you can stick on the castle itself, like rolling logs or rocks that will be pushed and they'll fall into the enemy's formations. And these are actually affected by physics in the game, which is pretty cool. So they did take some advantage of the technology that they were putting into this thing. But the technology is a double-edged sword. I will get to that in a moment. And speaking of technology, it is incredibly good to have that fully functional rotating camera to really be able to see the battlefield as you wish. You can't really flatten structures anymore. You have to zoom in really far to be able to do something like that. But it's nice to be able to completely rotate the camera around as you wish. You can also zoom in and out pretty easily too with just the mouse wheel. So that makes actually building your castles a lot easier, because now you actually have more control over what you're seeing, and you don't have to deal with the same kind of tile system that you did in the original Stronghold and Crusader, where it was pretty restrictive about what you could do. That said, building placement is now a thing, so you do need to keep that in mind. They have different zones where they are mandatory to have space there so you can actually get people in and out of the buildings. And so you have to actually pay attention to where buildings are facing this time around. Space management actually becomes a pretty big issue in this game. And you may be seeing from the footage that it's pretty cramped. Now, it's worth noting that the maps that come with the game, in terms of things like Skirmish, for example, are pretty terrible. They're extremely cramped. In fact, maps in this game in general are extremely cramped. And you don't really have the wide open area that you had in Stronghold and Crusader to build up the castle that you really want to have. And so, what ends up happening is that you basically just have to make do with what you got, and really focus more on choke points than actually building up a proper castle. Which gets pretty annoying, because it's Stronghold. I want to build a castle. I don't want to just build up defenses around choke points and then just focus entirely on that. That might happen in a map or two with, say, the original Stronghold or Crusader, but in this game, that's pretty much all you do. Unless, of course, you have a map that's more open and actually lets you build up a castle. But here's the problem. They put in a lot of new things. New is not necessarily a bad thing, don't get me wrong. It's nice to have things, for example, like different unit types, or new types of towers and such like that. That's all really nice to have. What I don't like, however, is the honor system. You now have a currency known as honor, and you gain this by having statues, which will give you a gradual trickle rate of a very, very low amount of honor. You can have the lady's bedchamber, where she will make dresses that can be used to make dances, which will then give you a bunch of honor. You can produce things like eel ponds or pig farms, where all this stuff goes into creating feasts, which will give you a substantial amount of honor. And all of this is used to not only purchase things like estates, which are now these smaller provinces that you can control. There's a province system in this game now. And they will actually give you tribute in goods, usually food or something like that, unless you change things up. But also to purchase units, once you get past spearmen anyway. You can buy as many armed peasants and spearmen as you want, as long as you have requisite number of spears or peasants, or both, respectively, and gold, at any rate. But once you get past that, you start requiring small amounts of honor. For example, archers cost 2 honor per archer, as well as a bit of gold, and a peasant, and a bow. Swordsmen cost 8, and knights cost a whopping 50 per, as well as a very large amount of gold, a horse, metal armor, and a sword. So you'll find that the addition of the honor system actually adds some more resource management on top of what was already in Stronghold and Crusader. And so you find yourself having to focus a lot on getting things that'll produce honor. How does that happen? Well, you produce a lot of these things that will allow you to host feasts and have dances, and then you're pretty much good to go. You don't really need a lot in that regard. You'll get plenty of honor by just kind of sitting around and having a bunch of statues, as well as doing that. Just don't get too carried away with it, because all of this stuff costs space on these very, very limited size maps. They also cost people. So you'll find that the population in this game is usually higher than it was in the original Stronghold and Crusader. You have a lot more buildings that you're producing, you have a lot more jobs that actually need to be filled, and so you're not going to be able to produce quite as many soldiers as you could in the original games. In fact, even if you go into siege mode, there's considerably fewer units that are actually on screen at once. And here's where another of the big problems in this game comes into play. I'm running this thing on the latest patch, on hardware that is way in advance of anything that could have been possible in 2005. I regularly see frame drops under 20 frames a second. Keep in mind that the highest I've seen it go is about 75 frames a second. There's something wrong there. And that problem is that the engine is not actually capable of handling what it is setting out to do. You can't have large numbers of characters on screen at once in this engine without the frame rate absolutely tanking. You can't have situations where the particle effects and the physics simulations go into overdrive because it will cause the frame rate to tank. So what you end up having is smaller maps, smaller castles, smaller numbers of units available. And if you're playing on one of the very, very few maps in this game that actually support numbers of players larger than about 4 or 5, you'll find that the frame rate is pretty terrible, especially when you get into the later parts of the game when there's large numbers of characters on screen at once, because everyone's built up their armies and is now actually fighting. You'll find that the frame rate regularly goes from about 60 all the way down into the 20 or less range pretty rapidly, and it fluctuates pretty wildly. And that's only one of the issues that this engine has. It's extremely buggy. You'll find that the pathfinding in particular is pretty terrible. People will get stuck on all sorts of things. You'll find that people get stuck within buildings when they go to work, and then say they decide that that peasant is going to become a criminal. Therefore, they're going to get stuck in that building and it's going to be completely unusable, and the guard won't be able to catch them. So, things like that happen all the time. Granted, that did get better with patches, but even when it's patched all the way, that sort of thing still happens. And I mentioned that you now have peasants turning into criminals. That's another thing that they threw into micromanage here. You have a guard post that you can build so that the peasants don't just run willy-nilly around to commit crimes, which is basically stealing stuff from your granary. And so they can catch the people, but only if there's a courthouse available, because then there's no jail space if there isn't. So you need an additional thing to micromanage and have more population for. And if you want the most efficient way of actually being able to deal with these criminals, your punishment has to be basically execution by chopping block. Because otherwise, you're dealing with things like the rack, or the gibbet, or any number of things like that. Stuff that takes longer and just isn't as efficient. So, you need to actually be able to build that. Only there's one problem, and here's what really drives me crazy about this thing. On top of all these other things that I've mentioned, there is, tied to the honor system, a rank system. These ranks restrict what you can build. So, for example, the chopping block is only available if you are at Duke level. If you're not at Duke level, you can't build that, and you can't build all of the best stuff in the game. So they arbitrarily lock things behind this honor rank that you have to generate honor in order to actually be able to promote yourself in order to build more things. It's just a dumb system, and I don't really know why they thought it was a good idea. Arbitrarily locking things in the campaign because it's just early on in the campaign, you haven't gotten to a point where you think that this would be handy. Okay, sure, I can see that. They did that with Stronghold 1. It worked okay. But here, locking it behind the arbitrary honor ranks, that's just dumb. And it even does that during skirmish mode. So basically, there's no reason to play a skirmish on anything other than the Duke level. That also gives you a ton of money to spend. So right off the bat, you're basically having a deathmatch game like you would in another strategy game out there. But if you wanted to make things take a bit more of a slow pace, then you would have to pick one of the lower settings, but then you wouldn't be able to build as much. It's just a mess. Again, I don't know who thought this system was a good idea, but it wasn't. And that brings up a point about this thing in general. It feels like they tried to make it complicated for the sake of making it complicated, rather than actually making it an intuitive part of the game. It's like they spread it too thin, trying to make more out of the management side of things, and make, honestly, less out of the military side of things, which is where it probably should have been in the first place. People don't really play Stronghold just because it has the management stuff in it. They play it because they like to have that and the castle building. And the castle building is the main draw of this game. Unfortunately, the castle building is one of the weakest parts of the game because of the whole not being able to build things with the space that you've got problem. And even when you go into siege mode, you find that the actual sieges are much smaller scale than they were in the previous 2 games, and that they're just nowhere near as satisfying or even really fair. The issues that exist in even the skirmish and such prevail here as well. You don't have as many units as you did in the previous 2 games, and so your defense isn't as strong against the enemy's offense, or vice versa. And so it's more of a make do with what you have situation than an actual siege situation. You're dealing with fairly small forces fighting one another, and with the pathfinding as problematic as it is, and the issues that you might have with the just various glitches that will pop up, it becomes more of a chore than anything else when you're actually doing sieges. It's a shame, really, because the sieges were one of the best parts about the original Stronghold and Crusader, especially Crusader, and here it's just not. And the general lack of maps doesn't really help that either. I mean, yes, you have a decent number of maps and such during the campaigns, but when you actually get into the real meat of the game, when you're playing skirmish or siege mode, you find that there really aren't all that many maps. And they're not all that varied either. Either you have really balanced but very plain and boring maps, or you have unbalanced but somewhat unfair and often way too cramped maps. In fact, all of the maps are way too cramped. You can't expand your castle enough. And that's just what kills this game in the long run. It had so many ideas that could have worked, and you can see where it might have worked. But the way they did it in this game, it just feels like a step back rather than a step forward. And a lot of it I can just feel like it's growing pains. They went from a 2D engine to a 3D one. It's technology they didn't really know what they were doing with per se. And so you know that there's going to be growing pains there. You know that they're not going to get it perfect the first time around. And so I can deal with the technical problems. Performance problems are one thing. Obviously at the time it ran even worse than it does now, and it was barely playable at best, so admittedly that's a fairly big problem with this thing. But now that the hardware has gotten better and you can actually play it, it doesn't run very well, but you can play it, the technical issues don't really matter quite as much. But even then, the design problems are what really kill it. Just trying to scale everything to this 3D engine that really couldn't handle what they were trying to do with it just destroyed the actual game dynamics. And so what you get here is, again, it's not terrible. It plays okay to some degree depending on what you're doing, but by and large, it's just incredibly underwhelming, to the point where I can't really recommend it. I give it a 2.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.
You need something?